Well, welcome to episode 264 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about the Modern Jazz Quartet's self-titled album. I think they're second on Atlantic, Modern Jazz Quartet. This is a 1957 original American pressing with this fantastic laminated sleeve and this wonderful photograph of the four of them on nice thick cardboard. It's somewhat well loved, this version, but the nice deep grooves make the crackles easy to tolerate. As a group, the Modern Jazz Quartet were attempting to play jazz which was consciously cerebral, not free jazz, not way out there, but more that it was influenced by classical music. It was more thoughtful, it was orchestrated, it relied on improvisation for sure, but in a much more, I guess, planned out way, in an interwoven way than the classic hard bop blowing sessions. Their instrumentation is gentle and percussive. There are no horns here, just vibes and piano leading the melody, and a pretty understated contribution too from the rhythm section. This is a long way from Art Blakey or Paul Chambers. Compositionally, the Modern Jazz Quartet was known for writing these longer pieces, often classically inspired. There aren't really any of those specifically here, although there is one longer piece, but there's enough of a mix of their other influences from classical, pop, and jazz to make this a pretty representative LP from this era of their existence. When talking about the Modern Jazz Quartet, it probably makes sense to start with the piano player John Lewis, who was, in compositional terms anyway, the musical leader of the group. He was born in LaGrange, Illinois in 1920. His mom and his dad split when he was very young. His mom took him out to Albuquerque, New Mexico, but then she died when he was 4, and he was raised by his grandmother and by his great-grandmother. He was trained classically on the piano, but he also absorbed a lot of jazz, which of course was the pop music of the day, joined up during the war, and in 1944 in France he meets the drummer Kenny Clarke. Clarke was a kid from Philadelphia who, like Lewis, had lost his parents at an early age. In his case, he was orphaned. He convinces Lewis that after the war's over, they've got to move to New York, that there's no future going back to Albuquerque. When the war ends, they do both move to New York. Lewis enrolls in the Manhattan School of Music, where eventually he'd get a master's in the early 1950s, and Clarke finds work with Dizzy Gillespie's big band. Gillespie's piano player at the time was none other than Thelonious Monk, but he leaves in 1946 to go solo. So Clarke does a bit of matchmaking, introduces Lewis to Gillespie, makes a favorable impression, and Lewis ends up joining the band as well. And he joins the rhythm section, which includes not only Kenny Clarke, but also Milt Jackson on vibes and Ray Brown on bass. Jackson was from Detroit. He was a musically gifted kid. He could sing, he could play the drums, he could play the violin, but he was smitten at the age of 16 with the vibes when he saw Lionel Hampton play. So he changes his specialty. He goes off to the war, where he gets the nickname Bags because of the bags under his eyes, which would get accentuated when he drank too much. After the war, he's quickly recruited by Gillespie into his band. As for Ray Brown, the bass player, he was the youngest of these 4 rhythm players in Gillespie's big band. He was from Pittsburgh, too young to fight in the war, but he arrives in New York basically as the war's ending, and he meets Gillespie eventually through Hank Jones, the piano player, and Gillespie recruits him as well. As his new rhythm section gelled, Dizzy could see the talent that he had, and he encouraged them to strike out on their own, not necessarily by going to other clubs, but first by playing sets as a quartet in between the first and second shows of the big band. Those were quite well received. Unfortunately, what was happening to big bands in general in the late 1940s is that their music was falling out of fashion as the beboppers began to get a bit of a hold on the public imagination. It was no longer economic, and like a lot of the other big bands, Dizzy's disbands in 1948 and 1949. At this point, the 4 members of what would become the Modern Jazz Quartet disperse, and they don't really get back together for 2 or 3 years until 1951, when they record for Dizzy's own label, DG, on a record called DG Presents the Milt Jackson Quartet. They were just starting out. They didn't yet have a clear concept of what they wanted to do, nor much of a big following, and Brown, for his part, had a better offer because he, of course, was married to Ella Fitzgerald, so he goes off to be part of her band, and Percy Heath, who had previously played with Gillespie on bass, steps in on the stand-up. At this stage, Lewis, Jackson, Clarke, and Heath decide to get serious and incorporate themselves as a legal society called the Modern Jazz Society, and to have a functioning performance wing called the Modern Jazz Quartet. Lewis was increasingly the organizational leader of the group, and he had a very clear concept, kind of like Jimmy Page did for Led Zeppelin, of what kind of group he wanted to create. He wanted to rise above the rough and tumble of the New York jazz club scene and the typical kind of macho hard bop blowing sessions. He wanted to have classically inspired music. He wanted to have music which was orchestrated. He wanted to draw on his formal training compositionally. if possible, he wanted them to be playing in concert halls rather than clubs. He wanted this to be listening music, not music where people were clinking glasses and chatting. Incorporation as a society was part of this. Also part of this was their adopting formal tuxedos or formal suits, like you can see here with their matching suits, to convey their seriousness and the fact that this was just not a bunch of guys showing up at a club. Their name bounces around quite a bit at this time. In 1952, they record as the Milt Jackson Quartet. They then record as the Milt Jackson Quintet. That's with Lou Donaldson added on saxophone. That's actually the record which has the very first recording of the famous standard Bag's Groove. Then they're signed by Bob Weinstock to Prestige, and they tell them they're called the Modern Jazz Quartet. And he says, okay, but your first record has to be called Milt Jackson and the Modern Jazz Quartet, just because of his name recognition value. That record really heralds the beginning of their ambitious compositional phase. It includes the track Vendôme, which is one of these longer form pieces I mentioned that is more classically inspired. They record a lot in these years. They put out a bunch of 10 inches, the best of which are compiled on the quasi-compilation record Django. They also do a great collaboration with Sonny Rollins. As I mentioned, in both their performances and their compositions, they consciously resisted the classic hard bop approach of the blowing session. Instead, their music drew on a whole bunch of different sources, not just the blues, but also classical and pop. And it was often very intimately performed, quietly performed. It was rather difficult to perform in clubs. Sometimes they would just walk out if the audience was too noisy. Their focus, of course, was on playing concert halls, which in Europe they were quite successful in doing. But not all of the band members were along for the ride with this vision. And in 1955, the drummer, Clark, quits, saying he could no longer continue to play what he called 18th century drawing room jazz. This creates an opportunity for Connie Kay, who had played with the great saxophonist Lester Young before, and he comes in the very next day on drums. With their new lineup solidified, their greatest years now beckon, because in 1956 they leave Prestige and they sign to Atlantic. That year, they then made the album Fontessa with its amazing title track, which is this multi-part, classically inspired piece. They also toured Europe twice and got to play the concert halls and get the kind of vibe that they'd been seeking, hadn't really been so successful at back in the States. And then in the spring of 1957, they went into the recording studio to make this record. This record is made at Atlantic Records Recording Studios in New York on April 5th, 1957. The engineer is Tom Dowd, and the producer is Nasuhi Erdogan. The Erdogan brothers, Ahmet and Nasuhi, of course, had founded Atlantic Records. Ahmet was the guy who dealt with the R&B and the pop stars. He, of course, was the guy who famously dealt with Led Zeppelin. Nasuhi was a jazz guy, and he was in the midst right now, in the mid-1950s, of turning Atlantic into not just a jazz label, but a serious highbrow jazz label. And the Modern Jazz Quartet were part of that project. The record starts with arguably the centerpiece of the record, although I'm not convinced it's the best track necessarily, which is a medley of standards, one by Irving Berlin, a bunch of others. Jackson's playing is great as ever, but for me, it's Lewis who stands out here. His playing is spare. It's much like Ahmad Jamal's, I guess, is the closest comparison. The next track, Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, is a much more upbeat and swinging affair. And on this track, I think Lewis's greatest parts on the whole record occur towards the end. The last track on side one is one component of an earlier suite of songs by Lewis called La Ronde, which had been recorded previously with Kenny Clarke on drums. Here it's with Connie Kay. It's just okay. I think Kay is let down by the recording conventions regarding drums at this point in history, which were commonly considered to be kind of a background ambient feature and were not as forward in the mix as we might have expected them to be, or certainly as we heard on Blue Note hard bop releases in the early 60s. So side one is a bit of a mixed bag in this record, but side two I think is excellent. It starts with a cover of Dizzy's Night in Tunisia. Yesterday's has some great brushwork from Kay and some rapid-fire runs in the vibes by Jackson. If you aren't already a convert to jazz vibes, then this track might convert you. The third track on side two is, of course, Jackson's famous Bag's Groove, first recorded some years before with Lou Donaldson, and then, of course, famously with Monk and with Miles Davis in 1954. This is a very bluesy version of this track. The record then closes with Baden Baden, which is an express train of a song, swings really hard, and both Jackson and Lewis shine. If not their finest hour, this is certainly a high-quality introduction to the Modern Jazz Quartet. I think it's let down a little bit as a record by that medley, which occurs right at the start. And as I mentioned, the engineering here lets some of the instruments down, particularly the drums. But this record is very much worth acquiring for the excellent second side and, of course, for this unsurpassed cover art. For me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.